They didn't arrive with armies, they arrived with smiles, handshakes, and words of friendship. But behind every handshake, an invasion had already begun. Before the gunfire, before the epidemics, there was a moment, brief, fragile, when hope lived between two worlds. The people of this land, those who today are called Indigenous, had lived here for thousands of years, building civilizations rooted in respect for the land, the waters, the sky. Their societies were sophisticated, their traditions sacred, their diplomacy deeply woven into every aspect of life. When strangers arrived across the ocean, it wasn't immediately seen as a threat. It was seen as something new, a meeting between nations. Across Turtle Island, the traditional way to meet outsiders was with caution, yes, but also with ceremony, gift-giving, and hospitality. To offer food, to share knowledge, to exchange goods, these were sacred duties. The Wampanoag people of the East Coast approached the starving English settlers in Plymouth, not with spears, but with baskets of corn and fish, showing them how to survive the brutal winter. In what is now Canada, the Huron-Wendat formed trading partnerships with French Jesuits and fur traders, seeking allies to balance power among rival nations. Far to the south, the Taino of the Caribbean welcomed Columbus with open hands, offering him gold and goods, curious but generous. These acts of kindness weren't mistakes. They were part of Indigenous worldviews that honored relationship, reciprocity, and respect. In many Indigenous traditions, newcomers were seen as guests, and guests were to be cared for, taught, and protected. But as the seasons passed, unease began to grow. The newcomers did not act like guests. They didn't leave after trading, they stayed. They built fortresses, claimed rivers, cut forests, and marked maps as if no one lived here at all. They brought with them a belief alien to the people of the land, that a human being could own a river, a mountain, a stretch of forest. For Indigenous peoples, the earth was a living relative. You could not own her any more than you could own your own mother. The newcomer's hunger for land was not seen as ambition, it was seen as sickness. And yet, many Indigenous leaders continued to hope that through councils, through agreements, through mutual respect, these two worlds could find a way to live together. They didn't know, not yet, that for many of these strangers, the meetings at the council fires were never about peace. They were the first steps in a plan to claim everything. Trust, sacred, fragile trust, was slowly being traded away for muskets, crosses, and coins. And so even before the first shots were fired, even before the first treaty was broken, the first and deepest wounds were already being made. The betrayal of trust. The first great wave of death didn't come from guns, it came from the breath. The people of these lands, families, elders, children, had never seen the invisible enemy that crept ashore with the first arrivals. Smallpox, measles, influenza, diseases so common among Europeans that they barely noticed carrying them. But for the Indigenous nations of Turtle Island, these were new horrors, unknown to their immune systems, unstoppable by their medicines, unimaginable in their cruelty. It didn't happen all at once. It started quietly. One family sickened after trading with newcomers, then a village, then a nation. Fever took hold, skin blistered, breath became shallow. In many places, there weren't enough living hands to bury the dead. In some coastal regions, entire communities disappeared within a few seasons, not because of war, but because of breath shared too closely, a handshake exchanged, a blanket passed. Along the Atlantic coast, settlers sometimes arrived at new locations to find abandoned villages, houses empty, fields overgrown. They claimed the land was empty, destined for them by fate or divine providence. They called it God's will. They never saw the thousands who had lived, laughed, loved, and died in silence before they even arrived. The devastation was beyond imagination. In some areas, up to 90% of the population was lost within a century. Elders, keepers of knowledge, mothers, hunters, storytellers, daughters, sons, entire bloodlines erased before their names could be written down. This wasn't conquest in the way history often tells it, with grand battles and heroism. This was conquest by silence. Imagine the grief, standing at the edge of your village and seeing no fires burning, no laughter echoing through the trees, no voices left to speak the old songs. Imagine knowing it was not your enemy's arrow or your rival's spear that destroyed you, but something you could not see, could not fight, could not even understand. And after surviving that nightmare, after burying your world, Imagine facing newcomers who stood on your soil and declared it empty, ready for the taking. The first invasion was not an army landing on a beach. It was a sickness carried in the breath, wiping away generations without mercy, without even knowing your name. And yet, through all the grief, all the loss, a few survived. A few carried the stories forward, and with them they carried something else, a determination to resist whatever came next. Because if disease could not erase them entirely, neither would the sword, nor the gun, nor the paper. After disease emptied the land and after grief hollowed the hearts of survivors, the newcomers changed their strategy. They realized they didn't need to fight every battle with guns. They could fight it with paper, with promises, with lies. At first, many indigenous leaders believed in the power of words. In their own traditions, agreements were sacred. A promise spoken under the sky, sealed with a handshake, was as strong as any bond between families. It was a matter of honor, not a tool for conquest. So when the newcomers proposed treaties, solemn agreements to share land, to live in peace, to trade fairly, many indigenous nations accepted. They met at councils. They spoke through interpreters. They made offerings. They smoked sacred pipes, believing the newcomers understood the depth of what they were agreeing to. But they didn't. To the colonizers, treaties were not sacred bonds. They were tactics. Paper shields used to buy time, to gain land, to avoid conflict until they were strong enough to take what they wanted by force. The Wampanoag entered into alliances with the Pilgrims, trusting the words of peace. The Hurons signed treaties with the French, believing in mutual protection. Farther north, Cree and Dene nations negotiated fur trade agreements with European companies, thinking partnership was possible. Each time, the pattern repeated. Land promised to indigenous nations was swallowed piece by piece. Resources were exploited. Sacred sites were desecrated. Agreements were rewritten or ignored as soon as they became inconvenient. Sometimes the treaties themselves were twisted, words mistranslated, terms misunderstood. Sometimes signatures were forged or pressured, and sometimes the very leaders who signed were never given the true meaning of what they agreed to. The newcomers used European concepts of ownership, things like property deeds, permanent borders, legal titles, tools that had no meaning in indigenous worldviews where land was shared, honored, and alive. Slowly but surely, the land was carved up, sold, stolen, parceled out, not with battles, but with documents. The betrayal cut deeper than any musket shot, because it wasn't an enemy charging with weapons. It was an enemy smiling across the fire, offering friendship, and stealing everything behind your back. And when the survivors protested, when they tried to hold newcomers to their own promises, they were called savages, rebels, obstacles to progress. But it was never the indigenous peoples who broke their word. It was never the indigenous peoples who forgot the sacredness of a promise. The ink on those treaties may have dried centuries ago, but the lies still bleed across the land today. The story they told you is a lie. They said the indigenous peoples accepted defeat, that they vanished quietly, that they stepped aside while history marched forward. Nothing could be further from the truth. From the very first betrayal, indigenous nations resisted, not with blind rage, but with fierce strategy, with sacred purpose, and with a courage that would echo for generations. In the Caribbean, when Columbus and his men turned from guests into conquerors, the Taino rose up. They fought back with everything they had: spears, arrows, courage. They resisted slavery. They resisted cruelty. They resisted dehumanization, even as disease and violence tore through their world. In the east, the Great Powhatan Confederacy, a network of powerful nations in what is now Virginia, met the English settlers with war when promises were broken and land was seized. The Powhatan leader Wahan-Sinakaw, often called Chief Powhatan, at first tried diplomacy, even offering food during hard winters. But when betrayal became clear, his warriors struck back in defense of their homeland. Farther north, the Mi'kmaq people of what is now Atlantic Canada refused to be subjugated by French settlers. They resisted colonial expansion fiercely, fighting through generations to defend their waters, their forests, their ways of life. Resistance wasn't just fought with weapons. It lived in every ceremony kept alive in secret when missionaries tried to stamp them out. It lived in every child taught to speak the old languages when authorities demanded English or French. It lived in every song, every prayer, every refusal to disappear. Every time a treaty was broken, indigenous nations answered, not just with sadness, but with strength. They formed new alliances. They learned the ways of the enemy and adapted. They used diplomacy when needed, and force when there was no other choice. Some fought open battles. Others fought silent wars of survival, preserving identity under the crushing weight of colonization. They didn't just survive. They fought for every piece of their existence. Not because they were savage, because they were defending everything that mattered: their families, their ancestors, their future generations, and the sacred bond with the land that no paper treaty could erase. The myth that indigenous peoples simply faded away is one of the greatest lies ever told. The truth is this: they fought back from the very first moment, and they are still fighting today. The early invasions shattered families, broke promises, and wiped out millions. But the real conquest wasn't just in the battles fought, it was in the systems built afterward. Systems designed not just to take the land once, but to keep taking it forever. After the first waves of sickness, betrayal, and resistance, the newcomers learned that brute force alone wasn't enough. Open warfare was costly. Disease had made settlements easier to build, but surviving indigenous nations still resisted fiercely. So the invaders shifted their strategies. They planted new seeds, seeds of conquest far more dangerous because they looked like law, faith, and trade. Missionaries arrived, carrying crosses instead of guns, but their work was no less devastating. They built missions across what is now the U.S. and Canada, in California, in Quebec, across the Great Plains, pulling indigenous children away from their families to civilize them. Language, religion, traditions, all targeted for erasure, under the guise of salvation. At the same time, new systems of economic dependency were created. The fur trade, once based on mutual benefit, was twisted into a trap. Settlers controlled the flow of goods, guns, metal tools, cloth, and indigenous nations were forced to trade more land, more freedom, more autonomy, just to survive winters and protect their people. Dependency replaced partnership, and slowly territory after territory slipped away. Divide and rule tactics further tore communities apart. Settlers encouraged divisions between nations, promising one group protection against another, turning old rivalries into bitter wars that drained strength from collective resistance. Maps were redrawn, not based on rivers, hunting grounds, sacred sites, or traditional territories, but on straight lines and squares designed by people who never set foot on the land they were dividing. Laws were written in foreign languages. Courts were built to enforce property rights that had no meaning to the people whose lands they were stealing. It was no longer just about muskets and flags. It became about paperwork, policies, and prisons. It became about indoctrinating the next generation to forget who they were. The conquest became permanent not because indigenous peoples stopped resisting, but because the invaders built entire systems to make resistance invisible, to turn survival into a daily struggle. And yet, the spirit of the land remained. Despite everything, the broken treaties, the burned villages, the stolen children, indigenous nations did not disappear. Their languages survived in secret, their ceremonies adapted and endured, their stories whispered through the mountains, across the rivers, through the wind. The seeds planted by the invaders may have grown into nations called Canada and the United States. But underneath, deeper than any flagpole or borderline, the original heartbeat of Turtle Island still beats. Fierce, wounded, but undefeated. Because the land remembers, and so do the peoples. They didn't just take the land, they built systems to make sure it could never be taken back. But the people, the indigenous nations, survived every betrayal, every broken promise, every silent invasion. And their fight for the land, for their families, for their future, never stopped. In our next episode, we expose how the theft became policy, how treaties became weapons, how forced removals tore communities from their homelands, and how indigenous resistance continued, even when the world tried to forget. Episode 3, Land Lies and Broken Promises, coming soon. Subscribe to History and Beyond. Share the real story. Stand with the truth, because the land remembers, and so do the peoples.